Thank you so much. It's a delight to be here. I see lots of people I've known over the years and a number of people I hope I get to know better soon. So, and I just love the name of the award, Every Woman Counts. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the figures of forgotten women. Because I'd rather talk more about them and maybe a little less about me, but I'll talk about me as well. So now a little bit about my story with some reflections on the leadership of women in our beloved church, which is sometimes late to the party in terms of inclusion, but works mightily to catch up once they get there, right? So I was a young woman of 23 when I went to see the Bishop of Central New York to tell him I was going to seminary. It was August of 1974, and I'd already been accepted at the Episcopal Divinity School in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I was going on my own self-devised trial year. But the rector of my parish said I should let the bishop know of my plans. So I met with Bishop Ned Cole, who looked a bit like Methuselah, and I told him what I was doing. I met with Bishop Cole just 2 weeks after the ordination of the Philadelphia 11, one of whom was resident in Central New York. Bishop Cole, although in favor of the ordination of women, was not amused. And he said, "Young lady, why exactly are you here? What do you want from me?" And I responded by saying, I came because my rector told me I had to come see you. And so here I am, and I don't want anything from you. And he laughed and replied, "You are the first person in a long time to come see me who doesn't want anything." He then looked at me over the bridge of his bifocals and asked me a question that I somehow knew was important to him. He said, "Gay, what will you do if you aren't ordained?" I looked him square in the eye and said without hesitation, "Something else." And he burst out laughing and told me he hoped he would be the first to know if I decided I wanted to be ordained. I didn't tell him that I was still a member of the Presbyterian Church, and that seemed irrelevant since I had been attending the Episcopal Church on and off for a couple of years when I was home from college, but that's a whole nother story. I went off to Episcopal Divinity School in Cambridge, Massachusetts for seminary, and my trial year turned into 3. And while I was there, I met at a poker game the man who has now been my husband for 46 years. Albert and I were married on August 14th, 1976, just before my last year in seminary and a few weeks before the historic 65th General Convention. After taking our honeymoon and moving into a new apartment in Cambridge, I made the first of many governance-related requests to which my extraordinarily patient husband has agreed over the past 4.5 decades. "Honey, could you set up the apartment while I go to Minneapolis to see what will happen?" He agreed. So, because the 65th General Convention in 1976 made the canons governing ordination equally applicable to men and women, I've served the church as an ordained person for more than 40 years. And I've been very fortunate. I've never done the same job twice. I was a hospital chaplain, a parish priest, worked on a bishop's staff for many years, worked for Credo, a conference program, a wellness program that Pan and I served on together out of the church pension fund, and then was elected president of the House of Deputies. The church we all love did something else when it passed the canon. Now, I have a confession. When I was ordained so long ago, I thought that was the big story, that women could be ordained. But I was wrong. I was really wrong. The primary reason I could even be ordained was because of the witness and persistence of lay women. But I did not fully appreciate that as a young ordinand. The history of the witness and persistence of lay women is rich, as so many of you know, and I thank EWIP for keeping so much of that history alive. In the 46 years since that, and it was tense, I was there watching from the bleachers, since that tense day in Minneapolis, the leadership of women, lay and ordained, has changed the church. The way we govern ourselves and the way we understand broader issues of inclusion. The movement for women's leadership established networks, it generated momentum, and it raised up leaders who pushed for the full inclusion of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people in the life of the church. It insisted that we deal with clergy sexual misconduct and galvanized other movements for justice. The truth I've come to understand these 46 years later is that my story begins not with the struggle for women's ordination, but with the struggle for women to take their rightful place in the governance of the church by serving in the House of Deputies. That movement began, as many of you know, in 1910. And some think we didn't get the job done until 1970, when women were seated as deputies. But for one convention in 1946, a woman named Elizabeth Huntington Dyer from the Diocese of Missouri was seated in the House of Deputies. And her bishop, Bishop William Scarlett, which is such a perfect name for a bishop, put her up to it. She was the sister of a priest and the niece of a bishop. And the people who wanted to see women take their place in the councils of the church thought she'd be hard to turn away. She served at that convention, but by 1949, the opposition had organized 4 duly elected women, one each from the dioceses of Nebraska, Olympia, Missouri, and Puerto Rico, were denied seats in the House of Deputies. And then there was another woman who's still living from the Diocese of Los Angeles, who was elected to the special convention in 1969 and was also denied seat, although she was then seated in 1970. The convention in 1949 decided to handle the controversy in that most Anglican of ways, appointing a commission. And this commission has my favorite name for any group ever appointed in the church. Its formal name was the Joint Commission to consider the problem of giving the women of the church a voice in the legislation of the General Convention. Perfect name. Its report is in the Journal of the 1952 General Convention, and I commend it to you, especially if you are a student of the many and varying ways the church can avoid committing justice. You won't be surprised to learn that the Joint Commission to consider the problem of giving the women of the church a voice in the legislation of the General Convention did not solve the problem it was convened to address. In fact, every General Convention between 1943 and 1964 rejected resolutions to seat women. In 1964, the bulwark that male deputies had constructed began to crumble. And some of you know the story of how it finally fell. The wrecking balls included grace, shame, and money. Dr. Pam Darling tells the story in her book, New Wine, and I relied on that chapter when I wrote a chapter on this subject in Looking Forward, Looking Back, a book of essays edited by Dr. Frederica Harris Thompson, a mentor of mine, a deputy, a laywoman, and longtime seminary professor. The book was to mark the 40th anniversary of the ordination of women. And it's a story full of lessons for the pursuit of equality in the church. And here's what Pam said, is what she wrote. Time after time, the women of the triennial politely petitioned, and time after time, the deputies refused, as each convention duly performed the rituals of deference and power embedded in the United Thank Offering, modestly presented by the women and magnanimously received by the men. Power does not bow to deference, she wrote, and it was not until a greater power was exerted in the form of the increasingly embarrassing distances between secular and church practices highlighted by presiding Bishop Lichtenberger's sharp rebuke in 1964, that the men of the convention finally voted to allow women to join them as deputies. Lichtenberger, a beloved bishop who was retiring due to ill health, spoke in firm tones to a joint session at the 1964 General Convention, pointing out to the assembled men the contradiction inherent in their refusal to seat women in spite of their willingness to accept nearly $5 million from the United Thank Offering, and to adopt a document titled Mutual Responsibility and Interdependence from the 1963 Anglican Congress. He said, "What we did this morning and what we do now is reality. The other is, I believe, the unwillingness to face the fact that women are members of the body of Christ, that they are of the laity and members of the body of Christ." Later in the day, one of my predecessors, House of Deputies President Clifford Morehouse, a distinguished publisher and vocal supporter of seating female deputies, called the House to order and directed that presiding Bishop Lichtenberger's statement be read again. Despite that appeal, the deputies were unhappy with the presiding bishop's attempt to influence business in the House of Deputies and stood firm. The next General Convention in 1967, the deputies finally gave way. And here's why. They gave way. Here's why. As the ECW's financial power grew, not surprisingly, so did the women's political clout. The United Thank Offering, which had totaled just over $44,000 in 1875, was up to $2 million by 1949, and in 1951, the year of my birth, received a single donation of over $1 million in addition to smaller gifts and coins dropped into its ubiquitous blue boxes. At the 1967 General Convention, Louisa Bailey of the Diocese of Atlanta was presiding officer of the triennial, and she found herself at the center of a storm. Presiding Bishop John Hines was promoting a $9 million special program that he said would allow the Episcopal Church, quote, to take its place humbly and boldly alongside of and in support of the dispossessed and oppressed peoples of this country for the healing of our national life. Bailey had been introduced to the issue of seating women as deputies in 1955 at General Convention in Honolulu, when she was first a delegate to the Women's Triennial meeting. I heard my first debate about women being seated as deputies and walked out because I was so angry I didn't know what to do, she told Dr. Mary Sudman Donovan, who was herself a pioneer of women's history in the Episcopal Church, in an interview for the archives of the Episcopal Church in 1983. She said, in the House of Deputies, and I could only stand on the outside, looking in. With Bailey presiding in 1967, the triennial meeting voted to approve Hines' request that they contribute $3 million to the special program. So the vote took place before the two houses considered the initiative, and the women's commitment to provide a third of the necessary funding exerted tremendous influence on the debate. In short, the women, denied a role in the governance of the church, exerted their authority by influencing the budget and pushing the church to look beyond itself in ministry and mission. You will not be surprised to learn that many of the men did not like this turn of events. They complained that the women and their money were exercising too much power. Mrs. Bailey remembered, we were constantly, harassment's not a good word, but you never walked anywhere that some man who was the deputy didn't bring up the subject. She responded firmly and politely and practically by locking the doors of the triennial meeting hall. She said, some were encouraged, but others were not. And that's why we kept the doors locked, she said, because I knew some of those prominent men and they would come in and influence us. Then came the vote on admitting women as deputies. First, the House of Deputies and bishops voted in favor of seating women as deputies. As I walked down the aisle in the House of Deputies, I'll never forget the mass of men snapping pictures of me going down. It was a great day in the life of the church. And it was not Louisa Bailey. It was all the women walking down that aisle. On that day, she became the first woman to address General Convention, speaking both in the House of Deputies and the House of Bishops. So, take a second to consider the magnitude of that fact. The first General Convention was held in 1785, and for 182 years, only men participated in it. For nearly 2 centuries, General Convention, the highest temporal authority of the Episcopal Church, heard and considered only the voices of men. Talk about being late to the party. During Mrs. Bailey's speech in 1967, word arrived that the House of Bishops had concurred with passage of the constitutional amendment that would allow women to be seated. And amending the church's constitution takes 2 votes of General Convention. And so after that, the story picks up 3 years later on October 12th, 1970, at the General Convention in Houston. The journal of the General Convention tells the parliamentary story. The secretary read message 2 from the House of Bishops, quote, which informed this House that the bishops had concurred with deputies' message number 2 in adopting in final action the amendment of Section 4 of Article 1 of the Constitution, which, by substituting layperson for layman, removes all constitutional barriers to the seating of women as deputies in the General Convention, end quote. If anyone ever tells you that church governance is boring and pointless, you can tell them that in 1970, it was message number 2 that brought the walls tumbling down. 21 years later, in 1991, Pamela Chinnis became the first woman elected as president of the House of Deputies. And in 2012, I became the first ordained woman elected to that post. In 2018, I presided over the first General Convention at which a majority of the deputies were women. And now, 52 years after women were seated as deputies, the president is a 41-year-old Latina laywoman, and the vice president is an ordained Indigenous woman. I can't wait to see how President Julia Ayala Harris and Vice President Rachel Tabor Hamilton exercise their leadership. Buckle up, church. Inspired by the New York Times overlooked series of obituaries of forgotten women, I began looking into how we remember the women who broke the barrier and gave women the vote in the Episcopal Church. The House of Deputies Rules of Order call for a necrology, which we now call a memorial roll, to be read and subsequently entered into the General Convention Journal. This is done at each General Convention to honor members of the House who have died since the last meeting of the House. It appeared that most of the women seated in 1946 or elected in 1949 and 1969, and eventually seated in 1970 and 1973 were not included. I looked at every journal. I did a lot of research, and it was my great honor to rectify these omissions when a special memorial roll was read at the 80th General Convention this past July. And it was powerful to hear the names of 59 lay women who had not been memorialized. There are more, so I'm continuing the research, and I plan to write about overlooked women and the forgotten history they made. There are stories remaining to be told. Just a few more thoughts. Women's leadership has helped break down other barriers. My friend Gary Hall, a seminary classmate who delayed his own ordination by a year, refusing to take orders when his female classmates could not, that's another piece of forgotten history, notes 5 ways, and I'm not going to do all 5, I promise, in which women's leadership has changed the church. I commend his essay to you. It's included in Looking Forward, Looking Backward. Gary says that the leadership of women has meant that the church has recognized what he calls the particularity of social location. I would argue, he writes, that the leadership of women clergy has been the driving force in our church's difference in all its aspects. Once men in church leadership had to recognize that their work could be done by others who did not identify as they did, they had to be open to the possibility that their own gender and racial and sexual identity were contingent and not absolute. A few years ago, I told a group of seminarians who identify as female that if we envision our goal to be the equality of ordained women in the Episcopal Church, or if we measure our progress solely by the number of female bishops, we are failing to understand the magnitude of the work God called us to. Especially now as we reckon with this crisis of racial justice in our country, we must understand that the promise of female leadership in the church will only be realized when we commit completely to dismantling racism, misogyny, homophobia, and all the interlocking oppressions that are antithetical to gospel work. I also told them to be wary of calls to respond to declining membership in a secular culture by circling the wagons, tightening up the hierarchy, and limiting the kinds of leadership we accept and the variety of voices we hear. The legacy of women in the House of Deputies has been to open the doors not only to other women, but also to people of color, to LGBTQ people, and to younger people called to lead in our beloved church. So I thank you, all of you, for your witness and ministry over the years. It makes such a huge difference to tell the stories of the women who have shaped our identity and our witness as the church. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Gabe. That was just a powerful message to all of us. It was great.